Europe just proved they know they are about to lose Africa. In this video, we will expose the growing signs of panic coming from European leaders as they finally begin to realize that Africa has other options and that their influence and control will not last forever. If you want to understand what Africa can do to break the neo-colonial structures that have held the continent back for so long, then this video is for you. If you don't know me, my name is TJ. I'm Nigerian and British mixed, and on this channel, we talk about African geopolitics. By now, you may be familiar with the growing G20 rift between South Africa and the United States. The United States chose to boycott the G20 summit hosted by Cyril Ramaphosa in South Africa, and the situation escalated further when Donald Trump announced that South Africa will not be invited to the next G20 summit in Miami next year. I already made a video on all of this. Of course, America is justifying this because of a proven to be fake narrative that there is a white genocide happening in South Africa. So yesterday, during a press conference, the Chancellor of Germany addressed this situation, and his comments reveal far more than what is visible on the surface. Let's take a look at what he said so we can break down what this moment really means.
As far as the G20 summit is concerned, I regretted that the American government was not present in Johannesburg last weekend. The American government is needlessly relinquishing influence, including influence in a part of the world that is becoming increasingly important. And I will try, in my discussions and meetings with the American president, to convince them that it would be good to invite all members of the G20 to America when we host the G20 meeting there, because this is one of the most important multilateral formats we still have in the world. And in my view, the G7 and G20 are formats that should not be made smaller than they are without good reason. They are important, and I will of course accept the American president's invitation, but until then I will try to convince him to invite the South African government as well.
What we have here is the German Chancellor, the Premier of Germany, the equivalent to a president or prime minister, publicly stating that he needs to convince Donald Trump to reinvite South Africa to the G20 meeting next year. This raises a clear question. Why does he feel the need to intervene and try to persuade Donald Trump? If we set aside the obvious public relations disaster of excluding the only black country in the G20 based on a falsified and racially charged narrative, we are only left with one conclusion. He understands the value of having an African nation present. This is supported by the fact that immediately after the G20 summit ended, European leaders traveled to Luanda for the EU-Africa summit. Then, days after that, the French president, Emmanuel Macron, visited 5 African countries on a diplomatic tour across the continent. Many of you have dropped comments asking how you can support this channel, even offering to donate or help financially. Until recently, I had no way to make this possible, but now through my Substack, it's never been easier for you to lend me some support. There's a free tier where you'll get 1 email per week, and for just $5 a month, about the price of a nice coffee, you'll receive a daily written update from all of my content, everything I produce. I'll be engaging with those of you who join, asking your thoughts on how to serve you and the continent better. Sometimes my videos do get demonetized, and there's also a small chance, as we saw with the platform Africa stream, that a channel like this could be deplatformed. Even if the worst happens, we can regroup, rebuild, and keep pushing forward. We don't want any third party controlling this message, so with email backing us up, we can communicate directly. Thank you in advance for signing up. I look forward to connecting with you, not just on YouTube, but via email as well. See, Europe has always known that Africa is essential to its survival. Europe built much of its modern wealth through the slave trade, through the colonial era, and through the neo-colonial structures left behind after all the independence. But 2 key things have started to change, and this is what has Europe panicking. Over the last 20 years, China has entered the picture and shifted the balance. Africa now has choices, real options regarding who it trades with and how those partnerships are structured. China offers relationships that are far more balanced based on mutual exchange instead of extraction. They provide infrastructure development and long-term projects in return for Africa's minerals and resources. And in doing so, they respect Africa's needs in a way Europe never has. The German Chancellor and the European Union as a whole understand that if Africa turns its back on Europe and the United States, the West will struggle to develop and therefore maintain its position as the developed corner of the globe. I mean, it's already losing that fight to Asia already. What we're witnessing is a historic shift in leverage, and Africa must take advantage of this moment right now. If you were listening to the agenda put forward in the G20 and the EU-Africa summit that followed, you will know that clean energy, sustainability, and climate change are at the top of Europe's priorities. They promote these goals loudly, and they want the world to embrace them. However, none of these ambitions are possible without Africa's participation. Green energy systems, solar panels, wind turbines, conductors, etc., are heavily dependent on minerals found in Africa, even more so than the systems that are currently in place that are not necessarily green. In this sector, Europe is already behind. China dominates the production of green technology, including batteries, solar panels, conductors, and other renewable systems. So if Africa maintains favorable partnerships based on its relations with China, Europe will lose access to those minerals, and Africa will gain the ability to develop without European involvement. After all, if you had a predatory partner or a fair partner, which partner would you choose? If you had a partner that claims that there's a white genocide in a place where white people historically committed genocide versus a partner that just says, we're here to do trade and we don't want to exploit, which partner would you choose? This means Africa must act now. Africa must recognize Europe's desperation and read the signs displayed throughout their behavior. This includes understanding what it means when efforts are made to convince Donald Trump to allow South Africa into the G20 meeting in 2026, something that is their right as a full member. Africa must use its leverage to secure the outcomes necessary for its own development. And here are my suggestions for what Africa must pursue to maximize this right now. Africa must demand the immediate dismantling of the CFA franc currency. There can be no true partnership with Europe while a predatory currency controlled outside of the continent continues to exploit African financial systems. This should be a non-negotiable. I would even go so far as to say that no African resource should be exported by any European country until this currency is removed. Difficult, challenging, radical, I know, but necessary. Next, Africa must demand a complete change in how financial debt is assessed and allocated. I recently made a video examining the statements of top CEOs from 3 African banks. They expressed clear frustration with the fact that despite having similar economic performance as many European countries, sometimes even better, African nations are still categorized as higher risk. This results in billions of dollars in unnecessary interest applied to African debt. Those additional billions could go a long way to help African development. If Europe wants genuine partnership in Africa, then every agency responsible for assessing debt risk must update its ratings according to the actual data, the same way they do for every other region around the world. Finally, there must be no extraction of raw materials without simultaneous investment in the industrialization and value of those same minerals. Meaning, if a country wishes to extract cobalt, for example, then they must also invest in cobalt processing, manufacturing, or education and training in that sector. If not, no cobalt should leave the continent. If these 3 measures are implemented, Africa will know that Europe actually means what it says when it talks about partnership. Without these reforms, all claims of value in Africa cannot and should not be taken seriously. There is also an additional point that Africa must keep in mind as this geopolitical tide continues to shift. Africa must recognize in terms of negotiation, African countries negotiating alone will always face pressure and manipulation. There's a reason there's something called divide and rule. A united African stance, especially through institutions like the African Union, at least how the African Union is supposed to be, transforms Africa from a collection of small markets into the most strategically important region of the 21st century. Europe knows this, which is why they have always preferred to deal with African states one by one rather than a united bloc. Another point that must be stressed is the importance of Africa controlling its data, its digital infrastructure, and its technological future. The next era of African global power will be defined by artificial intelligence, telecommunications, cybersecurity, and digital currencies. If Africa allows foreign companies to dominate these areas the same way Europe has dominated minerals during the colonial era, then the continent risks repeating history in a new form. Africa must secure digital sovereignty while it still has the leverage to do so. Remember, much of that infrastructure also is built with African minerals. When you put all of these pieces together, the full picture becomes clear. Europe is not panicking because they suddenly care about Africa. Europe is panicking because for the first time in modern history, Africa has the leverage to walk away. Africa has alternatives in China, in the BRICS alliance, in Russia, in India, in South America, partners across the global south, and in its own markets trading amongst each other. Europe has to scramble to avoid being left behind. What I'm discussing here overall is for Africa to have and maintain a Pan-African mentality. The idea that we should de-emphasize the borders which colonial Europe put into place. This doesn't mean making one unified African country, but what it does mean is allowing movement, trade, and development to cross African borders within the continent freely and without issue, so that we can increase the amount of trade that happens amongst us, which is minimal compared to the amount of trade that happens outside the continent. This is kind of crazy considering neighbors find it harder to trade amongst themselves than they do to trade with countries and blocks thousands of miles away from the borders of the continent. When you combine this unity with the desperation leverage we have discussed throughout this video, the momentum Africa could generate would be both powerful and transformative. The G20 crisis is not simply about an invitation. It's a symbol. It exposes the deep anxiety within Europe and the United States as they face the reality that Africa is no longer under their control. If African nations stay united, refuse to be intimidated, and negotiate from a position of unity, then this will be remembered as the moment everything changed for the continent. Europe knows they're about to lose Africa. The question is whether Africa will use this moment to gain the power, respect, and sovereignty it has always deserved. I would love to know what you think about this. Please leave your thoughts in the comments section. But if you have nothing to say, would it be too much if I asked you to write the words, "Actions speak louder than words"? It just lets me know that you watched the video to the end, you support the channel, you like what I'm doing, and you want me to continue. Thank you so much for watching today, and I'll catch you in the next one. Peace.